welcome back. In this video, I am going to introduce a concept, and that is it's a concept in the Catholic Church that is probably the hardest of all concepts to understand and to really accept, and that is the nature of redemptive suffering. And suffering is something that is actually going to bring you closer to God, and something that God perhaps allows in your life in order to help you grow in holiness. This is one of the most difficult things to grasp as a human being, because suffering is something that we all avoid at all costs, and rightly so, because it's painful and horrible. And who wants to suffer? Nobody wants to suffer. And so I'm planning on making several videos about this concept. For our purposes in this first video, I want to leave you with some concepts or some ideas of how you can learn how to accept suffering, and how you can learn to grow from suffering, and see suffering as something that will help strengthen your faith and not something that you ought to run away from. And the first idea that I want everyone to ponder and to think about, and this is something that I need to ponder and think about in my own life and pray over, is the idea of being willing to suffer. And what does that really mean? Because I think what's really tricky is, like, you're gonna suffer. So, like, what difference does it make if you're willing to suffer? Like, what does that mean exactly? Because, for instance, if you get cancer, say, you have cancer, like, you are going to suffer. There's no way to unsuffer, right? And the church doesn't teach us that we cannot receive analgesics. It doesn't say that we can't take Advil when we have a headache. It doesn't say that we can't try to relieve our suffering in some way. In fact, the church encourages us to eliminate suffering in other people as much as we can. And so one of our duties as Christians, as Catholics, is to help other people who are suffering and to help alleviate their suffering. So what does this mean when we say we have to be willing to suffer, even though we also think it's important to help relieve the suffering of others? So how can we make sense of this? This is a really strange, kind of contrary idea, and it can be very difficult to understand. When we talk about a willingness to suffer, and I'm not a theologian, and so please don't think that I actually have any spiritual authority here. I want you to talk to your priest if you have any questions about this. So don't take it from me. Like, don't be like, this crazy lady on the internet told me to do X, Y, Z. Obviously, take this to your priest, or read something that is read teachings on this from the great saints, not me, because I'm not a great saint, and I am not a theologian, and I have no, I'm not a priest. I'm none of these things. I'm just a mom. I'm just a woman that is trying to grow closer to God. But when we speak about something, this idea of a willingness to suffer, to me, what that means is you're not going to try and distract yourself from your suffering, okay? And especially when you try to distract yourself from emotional pain. To me, kind of all pain is actually emotional. I think that physical pain is actually emotional too, because it's the emotions, it's the feeling it's the fear of the suffering increasing in physical pain that often makes pain unendurable. And so a great example of this is if you are planning on having a natural childbirth. One of the things that women, people are about to have a baby, one of the things they train themselves to do is to sort of release the fear that they have in between their contractions, or the fear that they have while they're having a contraction. And so, the idea is like release, 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 and like this will pass, and like I can handle this, like I can handle this, this moment, and to try to really focus on the moment and not worrying about what is happening in the future. And so all of this is to say, I think all suffering is essentially emotional suffering as opposed to physical suffering, because I think it's the emotional suffering that comes with the fear of the pain in the future that makes the physical pain unendurable. Certainly, we can endure tremendous physical pain. People do often endure tremendous physical pain, and pain itself does not, to my knowledge, actually kill people. Pain is there to tell you that there could be something wrong, right? And it greatly motivates you to do something to, get rid of that pain. But so all pain is essentially emotional, and like all suffering really does come down to this emotional pain and this emotional suffering that we go through. And so when we talk about willingness to suffer and like the willingness to pick up your cross and carry your cross and to follow Jesus, the first step in that is to actually recognize when you are in emotional pain and recognize the pain for what it is. So recognize when you're hurting, which I know sounds crazy because, like, don't we all recognize when we're suffering? Don't we all recognize when we're in emotional pain? And the answer to that is like emphatically no, actually. A lot of people don't recognize their own emotions and don't recognize or acknowledge when they are hurting or in pain. What many people do is there is this like initial emotional reaction to something. So say somebody hurts your feelings, or whatever, and you have that initial hurt, which is like this sort of uncomfortable feeling, this sadness, as this a little bit of sorrow, and then like say somebody hurts your feelings. So then that could turn from like emotional pain, like a real sorrow, just a sad, like, why was that person mean to me? And then it might turn into anger, like, how dare you be mean to me? Or it might turn into jealousy, like in the case, let's say your boyfriend or your girlfriend or somebody is flirting with another person, like you might be hurt by that, and then it turns into jealousy, and then from there it might turn into anger, and then it might turn into this sort of like this chain reaction of emotions. I think as Christians, what we need to discipline ourselves to do is to pay attention to the very first emotion that happens when we're in a state of emotional turmoil. And many people actually don't have this skill. Many people do not recognize that initial emotion, and they sort of spin out and like go down this road of like, emotion. And then you're tangled up and you have no idea what you're feeling. Okay. So the first thing that I encourage everybody to do, and the first thing that I am going to discipline myself to do, is to look at my initial emotional pain when I am in a place that is kind of discombobulated. Again, emotional suffering is suffering. Suffering is emotional. And so what this could look like is, again, somebody hurts your feelings or something happens and you have a reaction. And I would, instead of taking action, so you could have a reaction, like an emotional reaction, and instead of acting on that emotion, or acting on that kind of helter-skelter, like, ooh, like I'm upset and I don't even really know why, take a moment, take a beat, and sit with our Lord and ask him to reveal to you what is actually hurting, like what you're actually feeling in that moment, and like where that pain and that sorrow is coming from. Okay. Because you cannot pick up your cross if you don't know what your cross is. Okay. Your cross is going to be that initial emotional reaction, the initial emotion that starts that chain of events in your emotional world. So it's the very first thing that caused you pain. And I hope that makes sense. So it's your primary emotion. It's not the secondary emotion. It's not the third emotion. It's not this series of emotions that come after you feel that initial pain or sadness or whatever it is. So you want to take a moment, and you want to pray and say, hey, Lord, well, don't talk to our Lord quite that informally, but talk to our Lord and say, I have this intense emotion and I don't know where it's coming from. And, help show me what my actual suffering is in this moment, and then be willing to accept that suffering. Be willing to accept it and recognize that it is there for your good, and that you have to acknowledge that you are in pain and you actually have to suffer in order to suffer, which is very redundant. But honestly, what most people do, what I do at least, is I try to get away from that initial emotional pain and I try to reason my way out of why I shouldn't be in pain. And I think there's this notion, especially among Catholics, who offer up their suffering. This is something that we talk about all the time. Offer it up to the poor souls in purgatory. Just offer it up, offer it up. And it's like, well, what are we offering up? And what is that feeling that is causing us pain? And like, what is the emotion that we are offering up? What is that suffering? Which is pretty easy to do when you stub your toe or something, but when it's some social problem, or when it's some emotion that makes you wonder if you're even a good Christian, like if it's anger or if it's resentment or if it's, like a feeling of where you unforgiveness or something like that, and you might be doubting your Christian virtue at that point. You're like, if I was a good Christian, I wouldn't be angry with this person, or I wouldn't feel sorrow over this, because we're told to be joy filled. Okay, but you can sorrow and still be joy filled. Those two emotions can exist at the same time, but you cannot ever get past suffering in any way or offer up your suffering if you don't know what your suffering actually is. So this is something that I want to think about. I want to think about this for myself, and the idea of like a willingness to suffer. And so the next time something happens that makes me uncomfortable, or the next time something happens that creates an uncomfortable emotion in me, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pray, and I'm going to ask our Lord to, help reveal what it is that is tormenting me in that moment. And then I will thank him for giving me that suffering and offer to willingly suffer that feeling. So that is the first step in learning how to properly suffer and to suffer well. You got to know what it is that you're suffering from. So, in other words, allow yourself to feel pain. It's okay. You're allowed to be sad. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to have all of these so-called negative emotions. In fact, it's in some sense a good thing if you do suffer these, because then you can grow in your faith, because you are learning to rely on God for your comfort in that, in those moments where you're learning to go straight to God and offer up that sorrow. Okay, so don't shy away from that. You're not a bad Catholic if you are having feelings that are negative. That's okay, or that what we call negative. These are just feelings. And I'm going to talk way more about this, but I just wanted to get this out tonight. I hope you guys can't hear my kids screaming. They're outside eating popsicles and yelling in the backyard. I can hear them yelling. I don't know if you can. I think they're having a good time though. They sound like they're having fun. So I'm going to go take care of them and go for a little walk with the kids and my husband. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.